Good evening, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to Hilaal Live. My name is Faraz Patel. I would like to thank you, the viewer, for staying with us, and my colleague Lukman Shadrack in Cape Town for taking you through the first part of the show. Now, of course, tomorrow, South African Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana will announce his midterm budget speech, and he is in a bit of a tight spot as he tries to rework the coffers of the nation in the face of lower than expected tax revenue and pressure from the ruling party to bolster government services ahead of next year's crunch elections. The government is likely to collect 52 billion rand less tax than projected in February. This is according to various estimates of economists. Now, they also expect the consolidated budget shortfall of 5.3% of gross domestic product in the current fiscal year, wider than National Treasury's projection of 4%. Now, to discuss this from a tax perspective, I'd like to welcome Jashwin Baijoo, who is the Head of Strategic Engagement and Compliance at Tax Consulting South Africa. Jashwin, thank you so much for joining us here on Hilaal Live.
Good evening, and thank you for having me on.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. Okay, Jashwin, we saw the Springboks. They put us on such a great high. Is our Finance Minister about to bring us a little bit on a lowdown?
Look, chances are there is a very real possibility. So we've obviously been following the trends very carefully. And I usually handle the post-budget debrief every year in Feb. So keeping my finger on the pulse and actually looking at market trends as well as the widespread speculation. First point of contention to note is our VAT rate of 15% is currently below the global norm. Global norm is 19%. So there's a little bit of leeway there. However, that being said, what must be considered is, should there be any sort of increase in VAT, not only will it impact on the broader economy, but also target the most vulnerable of society together with the wealthy, as your VAT is indiscriminately applied except for specific necessity items.
Jashwin, the VAT, and obviously we saw that 15%, of course, occurred during 2017. Is there a possibility that, you mentioned that we are far from the international standards of 19%. What are the chances it takes a percentage higher? What would need to happen for that to actually occur?
Chances are actually very slim. So what's caused what I like to call the fiscal pothole. We are in South Africa after all. But what they would look at to actually fill this fiscal pothole is primarily the wealthy. So there is also on the other side possibility of not necessarily increasing the tax table percentages, but lowering the bracket to qualify for the 40 to 45%, meaning that SARS's tax net will be cast wider. Now, if we actually look at the shortfall and the deficit, the main contributing factor is that the windfall in the mining sector has come to an end. Now, you'll recall over the last two fiscal periods, this has been one of the largest contributors to the corporate tax collections, and that has dropped by about 32%, leaving this massive gap that between the Revenue Authority and Treasury, they need to figure out how to fill. Taking it one step further, there've even been proposed budget cuts for SARS itself, for SARS's operational expenditure, which SARS is vehemently trying to oppose. However, the judgment call at the end of the day does lie with Treasury.
Jashwin, talking about SARS, I heard about a few SMSs or notifications going around about tax collection. I know you're laughing about this because you know full well about it. What was it? Was it a technical glitch, or should us as South African citizens be saying, hey, they may be onto us again? What actually happened there? Because I know you work quite closely with the Revenue Service.
Yeah, look, so I like to think that I work against the Revenue Service more than anything else, but that is to ensure that taxpayer rights are fully protected at all times. So what happened last week, and it's fairly interesting, is two-pronged. One, SARS sent out this SMS to any tax or registered representative who has a company dormant, trading, whatever the case is. But the appointed registered rep would have gotten this SMS if there were outstanding returns saying, listen, file these returns or there's intention to institute summons against you. Now, from a legality perspective, SARS are empowered by the tax legislation to then pursue collection or remedial measures directly against the tax representative in their capacity as such, and that would be personal liability that SARS would gun for. We see the same on the corporate front in general, where SARS have been known to pierce the corporate veil and actually proceed against directors or members of a CC in their personal capacity for recovery of outstanding tax debts. Now, on the other side, what they did was, and this is probably a mail merge exercise that they've done, is they indiscriminately sent out a mass mailer to any taxpayer who has a debt owed to SARS. Now, this included taxpayers who are in the dispute process pertaining to the same debt, taxpayers that have a payment arrangement in place for the same debt, and taxpayers that have entered into a compromise agreement or a debt reduction agreement with SARS, fully signed, executed, and have been adhering to their monthly or lump sum payment terms. They still got the notice. So I had a number of my tax debt clients get this notice, and I contacted the designated officials and told them, listen, we've got this notice. We know what the factual matrix of the matter is. Please just confirm for us this is system generated and may be ignored. So we then received written confirmation on a number of matters where the SARS official said, please ignore this. This is just a mail merge exercise. It's a system generated mail. And for all intents and purposes in this particular taxpayer's case, it may be ignored. So they are looking at strategies to cast that non-compliance net as wide as possible. And that goes right back to the systemic issue of there is this massive shortfall and they're trying every single avenue to make it up.
The wonderful world of our revenue service. Jashwin, 52 billion, the deficit. That, of course, this is what's projected by some economists. How does Finance Minister Godongwana try and make this up, even if it is around 50%? I mean, it's a challenge for him, isn't it, given, of course, the fiscal pressure that the country faces?
You see, the problem that comes in here is twofold. In the budget speech, they have a projected collection target for the year, right? And then somewhere along the line, when you're about 6 months in, as we are now, we're looking at the medium-term budget speech, and it's a case of, the Revenue Authority says, we have exceeded our budgeted projection. But that does not mean they have exceeded the actual budget. So they've set themselves a goal. Yes, great, you've exceeded that, but you've still got this massive shortfall. Now, what lies ahead of the finance minister is having to make a very tough decision. Either on one side, you look at budget and spend cuts, which may have an adverse impact on the country's infrastructure, but then you've got to balance that against the taxpayer. And look, let's be honest, taxpayers, even at this juncture, without any additional taxes imposed, are not the happiest, considering there is, in essence, tax brackets that serve as punitive measures. The better you do in life, the more you earn, and the higher you get taxed. Why? Because you are now funding governmental infrastructure, and government is known for spending large amounts of money, and it's not always justifiable. There are always elements of corruption in any governmental organization. And taking it one step further, you are now being penalized, in essence, for doing your job as well as you can and climbing the corporate ladder, so to speak.
Jashwin, one final question. You mentioned it, the taxpayers, especially in the middle class. Their hands are tight at the very moment. What about the corporates, the large conglomerates? We've seen Anglo American last week announce that they will pay SARS quite a substantial amount, but this is, of course, to exit South Africa and go onto the New York Stock Exchange. But what about these other corporates that have maybe been a bit mischief in paying their tax? Could you see SARS and National Treasury maybe going after them to try and at least cover the shortfall that has been projected?
Correct. So I've already seen SARS doing that. Literally this morning, I came across a new client and he's got 3.5 million owed to SARS. They issued a judgment. I've got another one. 22 million owed to SARS, they've issued a judgment. 69 million owed to SARS, they've issued a judgment. So SARS are taking the collection measures and the implementation of the actual legal measures very seriously at this stage. They've ramped up their power in terms of force put behind collections. And truth of the matter is, they have gotten to a point where collection measures are being aggressively implemented. Taxpayers are being indiscriminately contacted. And for the average taxpayer, I mean, to get an email saying you owe SARS R1 million, or to get an SMS saying, dormant company 10 years ago, but you're still getting an SMS saying, okay, you know what, you haven't done the formal deregistration process with CIPC, and you need that to deregister with SARS. AR deregistration, not filing for 5 years, is not good enough. It doesn't tick all the boxes, and you may be faced with summons and criminal charges if you fail to do that. That would be perceived by any taxpayer as aggressive, and they would feel it's almost like a personal attack. It's not a personal attack because, mostly system-generated mail mergers and just the click of a button. But at the same time, with SARS wanting to build taxpayer confidence and that accountability and transparency and faith within the organization, it does not come across that this is the right way to do it. When you receive letters of demand or emails of demand, taxpayers don't know that you need to quickly get a suspension of payment in place, or you need to get a deferral of payment if you can't afford it, open negotiations with SARS for a compromise of tax debt application to reduce your debt, deal with your interest and penalties, etc. And you now have thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, maybe even more, taxpayers sitting with a non-compliance status. So on the corporate side, as much as they can recover from the corporates, if a corporate's non-compliant, they can't get a certificate of good standing, which means they cannot get lines of credit, nor can they secure new contracts from other clients.
Jashwin, absolute pleasure speaking to you, mate. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's Jashwin Baijoo. He is the head of strategic engagement and compliance at Tax Consulting South Africa, of course. Tomorrow, that big midterm budget speech happening in Parliament by Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana. We will, of course, be watching that with keen interest to the decisions that will be made there. After the break, I speak to the South African Weather Service, Depot Tawana. Now, in the central parts of the country, of course, a bit of a freeze, some needed rain, but very, very cold weather. What is behind this current phenomenon as we head into the peak of summer? Do stay tuned to Hilaal Live.